Rain pattered against the windshield of Officer Tom Wilson's patrol car as he cruised down Cedar Grove's Main Street. The neon signs from local businesses cast colorful reflections on the wet pavement, creating a scene that usually calmed him after a long shift. But tonight was different. He'd already written 8 tickets, and his reputation as the department's strictest officer was something he took immense pride in. Through the misty evening, his trained eyes caught a black sedan rolling through a stop sign. A slight smile crossed his face as he flipped on his cruiser's lights. The sedan, sleek and unmarked, pulled over smoothly into an empty parking lot by Henderson's Diner. Wilson took his time approaching the vehicle, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The car was clean, almost too clean, with government plates that made him pause for a split second. But Wilson had dealt with plenty of people trying to act important. In his 15 years on the force, he'd heard every excuse in the book. The driver's window rolled down, revealing a woman in a crisp business suit. Her composed demeanor instantly rubbed Wilson the wrong way. Most people showed at least a hint of nervousness when pulled over, but she sat there with an air of quiet confidence that felt like a challenge to his authority. "License and registration," Wilson demanded, his tone sharper than necessary. The woman reached for her purse, her movements deliberate and calm. "Officer, I understand you're doing your job, but I'm actually on my way to an urgent meeting," she said, her voice steady and professional. "I'm a federal agent, and I'd appreciate." Wilson cut her off with a scoff. "Federal agent. Right, and I'm the president's personal bodyguard." His sarcasm dripped heavy in the rain. He'd heard people claim to be everyone from undercover cops to distant relatives of the mayor. This one wasn't going to play him for a fool. The woman's expression remained neutral as she reached for something else in her jacket. "If you'll allow me to show you my credentials." "Ma'am, keep your hands where I can see them," Wilson barked, his hand instinctively moving to rest on his holster. The situation was slipping away from his usual script, and he didn't like it one bit. In his mind, her calmness wasn't professionalism, it was defiance. 2 other patrol cars pulled up, their lights adding to the growing spectacle. Officer Kelly Reed, a rookie Wilson had trained himself, stepped out of one vehicle, watching the scene unfold with visible uncertainty. The rain fell harder now, but Wilson barely noticed. His focus was locked on proving his authority. When the woman tried once more to explain her status, producing what looked like a badge, Wilson had made up his mind. This had to be fake. No real federal agent would be this calm, this collected. They'd show proper respect to local law enforcement. The diner's patrons had begun to gather at the windows, their faces illuminated by the swirling red and blue lights. Wilson could feel their eyes on him, and it only strengthened his resolve. He was going to expose this impersonator and remind everyone why he was Cedar Grove's most feared officer. Little did he know, his next actions would set in motion a chain of events that would shake the very foundation of his career and transform his understanding of what it truly meant to wear the badge. The rain kept falling, washing away the last chances for him to step back from the precipice he was about to cross. His body camera silently recorded every moment, every word, every decision. Evidence that would soon come back to haunt him in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The diners pressed closer to the windows, unwitting witnesses to what would become the talk of Cedar Grove for months to come. The tension in the air thickened as Officer Wilson circled the black sedan like a shark sizing up its prey. The woman inside remained perfectly still, her hands visible on the steering wheel. Through the rain-streaked windows of Henderson's Diner, curious faces watched the scene unfold, their coffee cups forgotten on Formica tabletops. "Step out of the vehicle," Wilson commanded, his voice carrying across the parking lot. The woman complied without argument, her movements measured and controlled. She stood in the rain, her business suit getting soaked, but her composure never wavered. "Officer, I understand your concerns," she said, reaching slowly toward her jacket pocket. "If you'll just allow me to show you my credentials." "I said hands where I can see them." Wilson's voice boomed through the parking lot. Officer Reed shifted uncomfortably beside his patrol car, watching his mentor's behavior with growing concern. Something about this felt different from their usual traffic stops. The woman's patience remained steady, though a slight furrow appeared between her eyebrows. "Officer Wilson," she said, reading his nameplate, "I'm trying to cooperate, but you need to understand that you're interfering with a federal investigation." Wilson let out a harsh laugh that echoed off the wet pavement. "A federal investigation? In Cedar Grove? Lady, I've been on this force for 15 years. I know every operation that happens in my town." His pride swelled with each word, drowning out the small voice of reason in the back of his mind. The diner's cook, old Mr. Thompson, had stepped outside now, wiping his hands on his apron as he watched. He'd known Wilson since the officer was a rookie, and something in his gut told him this situation was headed south fast. "I need to search your vehicle," Wilson declared, his flashlight beam sweeping across the car's interior. "For all I know, you could be running drugs with a fake badge." "Officer, you don't have probable cause," the woman stated firmly. "I'm not consenting to a search. What I am doing is trying to prevent you from making a serious mistake." Those words hit Wilson like a slap. Who was she to tell him about mistakes? He built his reputation on being thorough, on never backing down. The growing crowd of onlookers only strengthened his resolve. Officer Reed took a tentative step forward. "Hey Tom, maybe we should." "Stay back," Wilson snapped at his rookie partner. "This is exactly what I've been training you about. People trying to play games, thinking they're above the law." The woman's phone buzzed in her pocket, but she didn't reach for it. "That would be my supervisor," she said calmly. "When I don't show up for this meeting, things are going to escalate quickly. You still have time to handle this professionally." But Wilson wasn't listening anymore. The rain had plastered his uniform to his shoulders, and each drop felt like another challenge to his authority. He'd dealt with clever criminals before, ones who thought they could outsmart him with smooth talk and fake credentials. "Turn around," he ordered, unclipping his handcuffs. "You're under arrest for impersonating a federal officer." The woman's expression shifted for the first time that evening, not to fear or anger, but to something that looked almost like pity. "Officer Wilson, this is your last warning. Think very carefully about your next action." The crowd from the diner had grown larger, their phones recording everything. Officer Reed's hand nervously tapped his radio, knowing he should call this in but torn between loyalty and common sense. The rain continued its steady rhythm, nature's drum roll to a moment that would change everything. Wilson stepped forward with his handcuffs, too committed to his course of action to see the storm that was about to break over his head. In his mind, he was still the untouchable authority of Cedar Grove. In reality, he was seconds away from learning just how wrong a person could be. The handcuffs clicked shut around the woman's wrists, the sound cutting through the patter of rain. Officer Wilson felt a surge of satisfaction, completely blind to the gravity of his mistake. The parking lot of Henderson's diner had become an impromptu arena, with dozens of eyes watching through the rain-streaked windows and smartphone cameras recording every moment. "You have the right to remain silent," Wilson began, reciting the Miranda rights with an edge of triumph in his voice. The woman didn't resist or struggle. Instead, she stood straight-backed in the rain, her professional demeanor unchanged despite the metal restraints. "I want everyone to witness this," she announced clearly, her voice carrying to the gathered crowd. "Officer Wilson is currently arresting a federal agent in the middle of an active investigation. This will all be documented." The words sent a ripple through the onlookers. Officer Reed's stomach twisted into knots as he watched his mentor lead the woman toward the patrol car. Something in her confidence made him deeply uneasy. He'd seen plenty of people try to talk their way out of arrests, but this felt different. "Call it in," Wilson ordered Reed, rain dripping from his cap. "Tell dispatch we got someone impersonating a federal officer." His voice carried the smug assurance of someone who thought they'd caught a clever criminal in the act. The woman spoke again, her tone measured and clear. "Officer Reed, I suggest you tell dispatch exactly what's happening here. Your honesty in this moment could save your career." Her words carried no threat, just a simple statement of fact that made Reed's hand hesitate over his radio. Mr. Thompson had stepped fully out of his diner now, holding an umbrella over his head. "Tom," he called out to Wilson, his voice heavy with concern, "maybe you should double-check her credentials before taking this further." But Wilson was too far gone, too invested in his version of events. "Everyone stand back," he commanded, attempting to maintain control of the situation. "This woman is under arrest for impersonating a federal officer, interfering with a police investigation, and resisting arrest." "I haven't resisted at all," the woman corrected calmly, water running down her face. "And you've just added another false charge to what's becoming a very serious situation." As Wilson reached for the patrol car's back door, 3 phones started ringing simultaneously: his own, Reed's, and the radio dispatcher. The sound pierced through the rain like warning bells, but Wilson ignored them all. "Your act isn't fooling anyone," he said, though a tiny seed of doubt had finally begun to sprout in his mind. The woman's continued composure was unnerving, and the growing crowd of witnesses made him increasingly conscious of his every move. Just then, the radio crackled to life without anyone touching it. "All units at Henderson's Diner, be advised. Federal agents are en route to your location. Do not, repeat, do not transport the subject. Authentication code Alpha 709er. The color drained from Reed's face as he recognized the emergency override code. Wilson's hand froze on the car door handle, the first real flicker of uncertainty crossing his features. The woman remained perfectly still, rain running off her handcuffs and creating small puddles at her feet. "Last chance, Officer Wilson," she said quietly, almost sympathetically. "Those handcuffs can still come off, and we can handle this professionally. Once I'm in that car, there's no going back." The diner's neon sign buzzed overhead, its red glow reflecting off the wet pavement and casting everything in a surreal light. The gathered crowd had fallen completely silent, sensing they were watching a career implode in real time. Even the rain seemed to have quieted, as if nature itself was holding its breath to see what Wilson would do next. In the distance, sirens began to wail, not the familiar sound of local police cars, but the distinct federal-issue sirens that meant serious trouble was on its way. Wilson stood frozen between his pride and the dawning realization that he might have just made the biggest mistake of his life. The Cedar Grove police station buzzed with unusual activity as Wilson sat at his desk, his once pristine uniform still damp from the rain. The events at Henderson's Diner felt like a bad dream, but the reality was crashing down around him with every passing minute. "Chief wants to see you. Now." The desk surgeon's voice carried none of its usual friendliness. Wilson stood up, feeling the eyes of every officer in the room following him. These same people who used to admire his strict approach to law enforcement now looked at him with a mixture of pity and disappointment. The walk to the chief's office felt like the longest of his career. Through the glass walls, he could see not only Chief Anderson, but also 2 stern-looking people in dark suits. The woman he'd arrested stood between them, now free of handcuffs and looking as composed as ever despite her rain-soaked appearance. "Come in, Officer Wilson." Chief Anderson's voice was tight with controlled anger. "And close the door behind you." The click of the door settling into its frame sounded like a jail cell closing. "Officer Wilson." One of the suited agents spoke first, his badge gleaming under the office lights. "I'm the special agent in charge of the FBI's regional office. The agent you arrested tonight is our lead investigator on a 2-year operation examining corruption in local law enforcement agencies." Wilson's throat went dry. The weight of his actions began pressing down on him like a physical force. On the chief's desk, a laptop played footage from his own body camera, showing his earlier arrogance in painful detail. "We've had multiple complaints about excessive authority in this department. The woman he'd arrested spoke up, her voice professional but tired. Your actions tonight just gave us a perfect example of the problem we're investigating. Chief Anderson leaned forward, his face flushed with frustration. Do you have any idea what you've done? The FBI has been building a case about police overreach, and you just handed them exactly what they were looking for. Outside the office, the regular bustle of the station continued, but it felt distant and unreal to Wilson. Through the glass, he caught sight of Officer Reed being interviewed by another agent, probably giving his account of the evening's events. Your body camera footage shows multiple violations of procedure, the special agent continued. Refusing to verify credentials, escalating without cause, making false charges. Each point felt like another nail in Wilson's career coffin. The woman he'd arrested stepped forward, placing a folder on the chief's desk. We have statements from 17 witnesses at the diner, plus video footage from 12 different phones. The rain didn't stop people from documenting everything. Wilson's legs felt weak. He thought about his 15 years on the force, his reputation, his future, all potentially ruined because he couldn't look past his own authority. The department's lawyers are on their way, Chief Anderson said, rubbing his temples. But I'll be straight with you, Wilson. This isn't just going away. You're suspended, effective immediately. Badge and gun on my desk. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Wilson slowly unpinned his badge. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the overwhelming realization of how badly he misjudged everything. Sometimes, the woman said, watching him place his badge down, the harshest lessons are the ones we need most. There was no triumph in her voice, just a quiet acknowledgement of a teaching moment that would ripple through the entire department. As Wilson turned to leave the office, he saw more FBI agents arriving through the station's front doors. They carried boxes and evidence bags. This was clearly just the beginning of a much larger investigation. His actions hadn't just impacted his own career. They'd thrown open the doors to the very scrutiny he'd always thought he was above. The night shift was changing over, and new officers arriving for duty stopped in their tracks, sensing the tension in the air. The story would spread through the department like wildfire. The tale of how Officer Wilson's pride had finally caught up with him, and how one rainy night at Henderson's diner had changed everything. The Internal Affairs office was smaller than Wilson had imagined, with beige walls and uncomfortable chairs that seemed designed to make people nervous. 3 weeks had passed since the incident at Henderson's diner, but its ripples were still spreading through the department like waves in a pond. Let's review your body camera footage again, said Lieutenant Baker from Internal Affairs, his voice tired after hours of interviews. The screen flickered to life, showing Wilson's confrontation from that rainy night. Watching himself on video was like looking at a stranger, a man so caught up in his own authority that he'd become blind to reason. Stop right there. Baker paused the footage. This is the 4th time the FBI agent tried to show you her credentials. Can you explain your thinking at this moment? The question hung in the air like smoke. Wilson shifted in his chair, his civilian clothes feeling strange after years in uniform. I thought I was dealing with another person trying to avoid a ticket. The words sounded hollow even to his own ears. The investigation had grown beyond just his actions that night. Internal Affairs had pulled his records for the past 5 years, every traffic stop, every arrest, every complaint. A pattern was emerging that Wilson hadn't wanted to see. We've interviewed Officer Reed, Baker continued, shuffling through papers. He described 8 separate incidents where he felt you exceeded your authority, but didn't report them due to your senior status. The disappointment in Baker's voice was worse than anger would have been. Outside the window, Wilson could see the parking lot where his patrol car used to sit. Now other officers walked past, some averting their eyes, others shaking their heads. The story had made the local news, complete with cell phone footage from the diner's customers. The FBI investigation has expanded, Baker explained, laying out photographs. They're looking into similar incidents across 3 counties. Your arrest of their agent opened a door they'd been trying to get through for months. The photos showed other officers, other departments, other instances of authority being misused. Wilson's stomach churned as he realized he wasn't just in trouble. He'd become the face of everything wrong with power going unchecked. Mr. Thompson from the diner gave a statement. Baker continued, pulling out another file. He's known you since you were a rookie. Says you used to be different, used to care more about helping people than showing your authority. The words stung because they were true. The investigation was thorough, methodical, and deeply uncomfortable. Every complaint Wilson had dismissed, every warning he'd ignored, every time he'd let his badge go to his head. It was all laid out in black and white. Your dash cam recordings show a pattern, Baker said, clicking through more footage. The way you speak to people, the way you escalate situations. When did it start changing, Wilson? When did the job become about power instead of protection? A custodian passed by the office window, pushing his cart. He'd been cleaning these halls for 20 years, had seen officers come and go. His quiet nod to Wilson held something between sympathy and judgment. The FBI agent you arrested, Baker mentioned, checking his notes. She's recommended against criminal charges. Wilson looked up in surprise. She says the incident might serve a better purpose as a teaching tool for other departments. The hearing room felt colder than usual on this autumn morning. Wilson sat alone at the long table, his formal uniform feeling stiff and unfamiliar after 2 months of suspension. The brass buttons that he'd once polished with pride now seemed to mock him with their shine. Officer Thomas Wilson, the Department Review Board chairman, began, his voice echoing in the quiet room. We're here to determine the future of your law enforcement career. 5 stern faces looked down from their elevated seats, each holding copies of the extensive investigation files. The local newspaper sat folded on a nearby chair. Wilson had stopped reading it weeks ago when his story became front-page news. Local officer's power trip leads to FBI investigation, the headlines had screamed. His teenage daughter had come home crying after classmates shared cell phone videos of his arrest at the diner. The Internal Affairs investigation has revealed 27 incidents of questionable conduct. The chairman continued, flipping through papers. 17 complaints about excessive authority. 12 instances of escalating routine traffic stops unnecessarily. Each number felt like another weight added to Wilson's shoulders. Officer Reed sat in the back of the room, there to testify about his experiences as Wilson's trainee. Their eyes met briefly, and Wilson saw something he hadn't noticed before. Not judgment. 2 years later, Wilson stood at the front of the police academy classroom, his badge catching the morning light streaming through the windows. It wasn't the same badge he'd worn that rainy night at Henderson's diner. This one was newer, earned back through months of retraining, counseling, and proving himself worthy of a second chance. I want you to look at this body camera footage, he told the room full of fresh-faced recruits. The screen behind him flickered to life, showing that fateful night from his perspective. Some of the cadets shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing him in the video. What you're watching isn't just a mistake, Wilson continued, his voice carrying the weight of experience. It's what happens when you forget why you wanted to wear the badge in the first place. The footage played silently, showing his confrontation with the FBI agent. One of the cadets raised his hand. Sir, didn't this incident lead to the department's reform program? Wilson nodded, a small smile crossing his face. It did. Sometimes the biggest changes come from the worst mistakes. He clicked to the next slide, showing newspaper headlines about the subsequent investigation and reforms. The classroom felt different from the other places he'd worked since his suspension and retraining. After 6 months of desk duty, cultural sensitivity training, and working with community outreach programs, he'd found his true calling. Teaching new officers how to avoid the pitfalls he discovered the hard way. The FBI agent I arrested that night. Wilson gestured to another slide. She's now in charge of training programs across 3 states. We worked together sometimes, teaching departments about the difference between authority and power. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The incident that had nearly ended his career had transformed into a powerful teaching tool. Police academies across the country now used his body camera footage as an example of how quickly authority could corrupt judgment. Last week, I was getting coffee at Henderson's Diner, Wilson shared, pacing slowly across the front of the room. The same place where everything went wrong. Mr. Thompson, the owner, stopped by my table. Know what he said? The cadets leaned forward, engaged in the personal story. He said he's proud of what I've become. That I'm doing more good now than I ever did writing tickets and throwing my weight around. Wilson paused by the window, looking out at the academy grounds where new recruits were running drills. But here's the real lesson. He turned back to the class. It's not about me. It's about what happens when good officers forget they're here to protect and serve, not to dominate and control. A young cadet in the front row spoke up. Do you regret what happened that night? Wilson considered the question carefully. I regret letting power change me. I regret every person I treated poorly because I thought the badge made me better than them. But I don't regret learning from it. Sometimes the hardest lessons leave the deepest impact. The morning sun cast long shadows across the classroom floor as Wilson clicked to his final slide, a recent photo of him with his daughter at her high school graduation. She was ashamed of me after the incident, he admitted. Now she tells her friends her dad teaches cops how to be better people. As the class ended and the cadets filed out, several stopped to shake his hand or ask questions. Through the hallway windows, Wilson could see more recruits arriving for the afternoon session. Each face represented a chance to shape the future of law enforcement, to turn his mistake into something meaningful. Later that day, as Wilson packed up his teaching materials, he found a note left on his desk. It was from Officer Reed, who now worked as a training supervisor in another district. Thanks for showing us all how to learn from our mistakes, it read. You're teaching the right lessons now. Wilson pinned the note to his office board, next to the newspaper clipping about the department's reforms and a photo of last year's graduating class. The badge on his chest felt different now, not as a symbol of authority, but as a reminder of the trust he'd lost and worked hard to regain. As he headed home that evening, Wilson drove past Henderson's Diner. The neon sign glowed just like it had that rainy night, but everything else had changed. He had changed, and maybe, just maybe, that change would help create a new generation of officers who understood that true strength came from serving the community, not from showing power over it.